following video was recorded live at the conference and produced by the Sound of Knowledge Incorporated. Welcome to the Black Hat Briefings 1999. This meeting was held in exciting Las Vegas, Nevada from July 7th through the 8th. This is videotape number 31, Track B, Introduction to Cyber Forensic Analysis.
Thank you. With all that, I can hardly wait. Actually, I should have had that changed. It isn't InfoSec Technologies anymore. It's Intrusion Management and Forensics Group, but that doesn't matter. What we're going to talk about this afternoon is internet security incidents, and nobody here, I'm sure, has ever participated in one of those. And certainly none of you have ever had to investigate one. What I want to do in this hour is I want to discuss some basic techniques. Basically, we're going to have to just sort of skim the top of this because there's just too much. As I was telling a gentleman over here, this is a distillation of a 2-hour talk, which was a distillation of a 1-day course, which was the distillation of a 2-day course, which I'm being asked to turn into a 3-day course. And so obviously, we're not going to get into a lot of detail. Feel free to interrupt, ask questions. Please don't throw things. It really messes up the wall behind me. We've got a number of things we're going to look at today. So we're going to talk about, very briefly, intrusion approaches, something that I'm sure is near and dear to the heart of many of you. We're going to look at how we can investigate an internet intrusion, some approaches to investigating an intrusion. Going to look at some end-to-end tracing requirements, evidence collection and preservation. We're going to talk a little bit about forensics. There's a lot of other forensic discussions going on here at the conference. I've been through a number of the presentations in the book, and I have some comments, and it's good stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about forensics as it applies to DOS. But there's been some good research lately been done on Unix, and there's some good stuff coming out on NT as well. So we'll talk just a little bit about that. We'll also look at ARMON2-based tools for documenting the path of an attack. So with all that in mind, let's get started. First of all, we want to define cybercrime. Crimes directed against a computer are the classical, that's the classical definition of a computer crime. The FBI defines computer crime as crime directed against a computer. Now, that's not the only thing that we can have. We can also have crimes where the computer contains the evidence, and we can have crimes where the computer is actually used to commit the crime. So all of those areas are areas of concern when we're dealing with a virtual crime scene. Now, as if anybody needed to be told, the Computer Security Institute and the FBI do an annual study, and they've concluded that, yes, we do have computer-related crime. The FBI is good at this, and the Computer Security Institute funds it, so we know it's accurate. Most crime comes from disgruntled employees. Now this says that 80% of the organizations that reported computer-related crime or computer security incidents reported that those incidents were caused by insiders. Now there's a lot of sizzle on the internet. A lot of people out there saying that's where the action is. But if we believe this, the real action is inside the organization. Now that's good news for when you have to trace a crime, because you may have the entire path of the incident within your organization where you have control of it. They had to put in hackers here, and I'm not quite sure what that means. I'm not sure whether that means people who came in from outside, evil, wicked, mean, bad, nasty personalities who may be hidden inside. It's a little hard to tell these days, and one of the reasons it's hard to tell is it's hard to tell where the internal network ends and the external network begins. We have intranets, internets, extranets. We connect to everybody and their dog, and it's just really hard to tell where the networks start and stop. So I'm not quite sure what this means. This is the one I'm mostly concerned about here. Now down here, 45% of the companies that reported that the incident was unauthorized access. Nearly twice the denial of service attacks and outside penetrations. I'm not sure what unauthorized access means. I just know that somebody somewhere thinks they weren't supposed to do it. So that's what we're looking at. That's what we're investigating. That's the reason that we're here. Now, to keep it simple, there are only 4 kinds of attacks possible against a network device. A denial of service attack, a social engineering attack, a technical attack, and I'll get to that in a minute, and sniffing. Technical attacks are all those exploits that we're hearing about. The discussions that are taking place in the hallways here. All of the stuff that's going to be at DEF CON here later on this week. Exploits. Those are the technical attacks. They all fit into that. As we investigate these types of incidents, we need to bear in mind that our investigation needs to concentrate on the fact that there are only 4 basic ways of approaching a break-in to a system. Now, when we start looking at how an intrusion occurs from the investigator's perspective, not talking about now from the attacker's perspective, but now we're looking at this from the investigator's perspective. First of all, we know that the attacker is going to do some research and select a target. They'll do things like internet searches. They'll use standard run-of-the-mill utilities like Whois and NSLOOKUP. We don't know this is happening. We have no way of knowing it's happening. And unless we happen to be able to get a hold of the attack computer, in other words, the computer that did this, we'll never know. So this preliminary information that might give us as investigators a heads up is simply not available to us. Can we use it as evidence later? Maybe. There's another thing we have to remember, and that is that we can narrow an attack down using forensic analysis and using backtracing techniques to a machine. Placing a human at that machine, more importantly, a specific human at that machine, is far more difficult. So we're going to discuss today, fundamentally, taking the attack to the machine. Once our intruder has, or our potential intruder, has selected the target, gotten some information, and when we do vulnerability analysis for our clients, we always begin this way with what we refer to as a zero information-based attack. Given the name of the organization, how much can I find out about them on the public internet? The next thing they're going to do is some preliminary probing. And they're going to want to avoid logging. They want to try to get passwords. The object, of course, is to come into the system as quietly and as unobtrusively as possible. That makes it even more difficult for us as investigators to narrow down the path of the attack. And remember now, we're not talking about just an attack over the internet. We're talking about an end-to-end attack. We're looking at it from the perspective of an investigator who eventually is going to have to take this into a court of law or perhaps face some sort of adjudication panel because we fired somebody for breaking into our system from inside, an employee that was supposed to be there, that actually did this to us, that had the colossal, unmitigated gall to attack his own system. And his attorney says, well, there was no reason he shouldn't do that. He works there, doesn't he? He's allowed to use the computers, isn't he? And we're going to have to prove malicious intent and that he violated policies. More about policies later. So this individual is going to do everything they can do to get more information without tripping an alarm, without tripping an IDS, without putting an entry in a log. And they'll do things like probe the popper, great little attacks against the popper that don't log, sniffing, zone transfers, all sorts of things that get more information and don't log. I want to just jump up here a minute again, tell you a little story. Several years ago, not too many actually, we had a client that wanted us to do an attack on them. And the premise was that we were consultants and we were brought into the company to do something, had no idea what. And the objective was to see how deeply into their system we could get. We were given a cubicle, a computer, and a normal account on the LAN, and that's it. And we were left to our own devices. First thing we did is go out onto the internet and do some of this preliminary stuff. I did a search on the company name. I got about 5,000 hits. One of those hits was a complete network map. It showed me the network operating system, the hosts that were in use on the system, their mainframe, their routers, their IP addresses. Everything was there, everything. And it wasn't on the website of the client either. It was on the website of a moderately well-known router manufacturer who was bragging that this big company was one of their largest clients. And here's how good their routers looked on their network. You never know what you'll find. You never know what you'll find. Next thing that's going to happen is they're going to search for possible backdoors. Not the kind of backdoors that get put in later, the kind of backdoors that get put in by employees, legitimate ones. You know, the desktop modem, the one that's connected to reach out. Yeah, that one. With no password, that's the one. And then they'll eventually try a technical attack, an exploit of some sort, maybe some social engineering. And as investigators, we need to pick up the trail here. Of course, it's a little difficult to pick up the trail up there, but the point is we have to pick it up as early as we possibly can. And one more thing that's important is not only do we have to pick up the trail, but we have to preserve the evidence in such a way that it's not subject to challenge in court. And that's the problem. With very few exceptions, I imagine most of us in this room are technical. And we think of things in technical terms. We think of things in terms of what we know from our experience to be technically true. And we believe that's evidence. Sorry. It's not evidence unless we can convince a jury that it's evidence. The next thing that we're interested in is we're interested in seeing evidence of where our attacker cleaned up after the attack. They're going to delete tools and work files if they're smart. As we're going to learn in a few minutes when we talk about criminal profiling, we're going to find out that how smart they are tells us a lot about what kind of an attacker they are. They're going to try to modify logs. In the Unix example, things like syslog, message files, the SU log. They'll go in and they'll play games with the last log. And how well they do that tells us a lot about the skill level of the attacker. So here's an investigative axiom for you. Treat every investigation as if it will end up in a criminal prosecution. Now, most won't. Almost none will, in my experience. And by the way, I'm not necessarily talking about hacker tracking, as somebody told me. Oh yeah, you're a hacker tracker, cyber cop. No, just a consultant, likes to play a little chess. If you do this, you will maintain high standards in your evidence collection and preservation. And that's critical to having a successful investigation, because an investigation is not successful when you decide you know who done it. The investigation is successful when you prove who done it. That's when the investigation is successful. Oh, and it also helps if they actually did. Now, what's your toolkit? What do you got to work with? Well, you got policies. We're going to talk about policies. Be careful of screwing around when you don't have policies, friends. Because if you don't have policies, that snake's going to come back and bite you. And we'll see why in a minute. Criminal profiling is another tool you have. Tracing tools, log analysis, crime scene analysis, and we're going to assume for the purpose of this very short hour that the crime scene is the victim computer. What we do on attack computers and computers that are evidence containers is not dissimilar, but it's different enough so for the purposes of this, we're going to stick to the victim computer. We're going to look a little bit at email header analysis and newsgroup header analysis. These are tools that you have to trace back an attack. Now, policies. Policies are really important. If we take the approach that we're investigating an event that has occurred within our organization, which if you'll remember, 80% are likely to, then policies define the actions that we can take. If you don't have a policy, for example, if you don't have a specific privacy policy, you can't intercept email. You can't intercept information that's passing from inside your system to somewhere outside. They have to be clear and simple to understand, and the employee has to acknowledge that they read them, understand them, and will comply with them, and it's best if they acknowledge it in writing. Now, a lot of organizations are using banners, log-on banners, and that's good, that works. Log-on banners that say that when you're using the system, you're subject to monitoring, you have no expectation of privacy, those kind of things, and if you don't like it, don't log in. And of course, policies can't violate the law. Now, the enabling law here is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. And it's a great big long act that has about 3 or 4 things in it that we're really concerned with. First of all, you can intercept communications between an intruder and your organization's computer system. And that implies an intruder from the outside. You can intercept with prior consent of the user inside. Prior consent. That's why you need the policy and the acknowledgement, because that constitutes prior consent. You can intercept portions of communications necessary to determine origin and destination. You can always do that. You don't need prior consent to read headers. You need prior consent to read content. And you can intercept where it's necessary to protect your rights or property. The comment is the last one says you can do anything. Maybe. The point here is not what we believe to be so, but what some slick lawyer on the other side can convince a jury may be so. And so in my experience, it's better to err on the side of caution. There is one major point where you digress from that, and that is when you become an agent of law enforcement. When you become an agent of law enforcement, you're doing something that law enforcement would need to have a warrant to do. Here's an example. Since you started this, Paget, I'm going to pick on you. Never sit in the front row or the second row. Suppose, for example, that I decide that Paget here has been stealing from the company. So I call up my local FBI office and I say, Agent Scully, I think Paget Peterson has been stealing from the company. And Agent Scully says, oh, okay, why? And I say, well, he's acting strange. Well, Agent Scully is probably going to tell me that there isn't a whole lot she can do. Almost no judge will issue a warrant to go in and search Paget's computer based upon the fact that he's acting strange. So I go off, and in the middle of the night, I sneak into his office, and I get that computer, and I take a mirror image of it, and I take that mirror image back to my lab, and I examine it, and by golly, he's not doing some very nice things. I got him. So I call back at the FBI, and I say, Agent Scully, I just took an image of his computer. I just took an image of his computer, and lo and behold, I was right. She won't do a thing. Can't. Because if she did, I would have acted as an agent of the police, because the FBI couldn't get a warrant. I knew they couldn't get a warrant. I did something they would have to get a warrant to do, and then I gave it back to them. So in those circumstances, I have to behave as the FBI would have to behave, and I would have had to have gotten a warrant as well.
But wait.
There's more. Exactly. He says if I hadn't phoned up Agent Scully first, if I had done the mirror before, yes, and that's what you do. We're winning. Okay. Crime scene analysis is a branch of criminal profiling that uses standard investigative techniques to analyze crime scenes. And what we're concerned with here is we're concerned with looking at the victim computer, analyzing what happened to it in the course of the attack, and from that analysis, drawing conclusions about the attacker. Some of the conclusions that we can draw are skill level, motivation. We can also pick up perhaps the source of tools, if the tools are unique. There's been some good work done at Purdue University on software forensic analysis and looking at tools to figure out who wrote the tools, or viruses to look at who wrote the virus. And investigators tend to be more comfortable with this kind of investigation, this branch of criminal profiling, because it's not real exotic. So how do we develop a profile of an intruder? In crime scene analysis, we look at how access was obtained. How did they break in? What skills were required to break into the system? How did the intruder behave on the system? If they were in there to steal information, and we can tell, we can't always tell, but if we can tell, did they do damage, which indicated that they may not have understood the system fully? Were they careless? Were they in a hurry? Did they clean up well after themselves? Did we find remnants of tools? How well were the tools hidden? Did they just slap a few things into the /temp directory and then run away and leave them? Or were they really clever and created a dot directory underneath there so that nobody could find it? Truly elite. Then we can use a little investigative psychology. What's the motivation for this? Is this a disgruntled employee getting even with his employer? Is this a script kiddie who's just developed the new latest and greatest denial of service attack and wants to try it on every system on the internet just to see how well it works? What personality type is necessary here? Time to digress into another war story. Had a client that had a break into a mainframe. The attacker got into the mainframe, got into a particular program, which was a critical program for this particular client, zapped one word in memory, which was the right word to bring down the system. When we looked at it, and I didn't look at it too hard because there was a consultant from one of the, at the time, the big six. Now I guess they're the funky five or something. They were the silly six at that point. This investigator concluded that the person who did this had to have a very high skill level. Well, that makes sense. They had to understand the program, which was, in fact, a custom-written program. They had to get past top secret, which, if it's configured right, is no mean task. They had to know where that word existed, and they had to know what the memory offset was so they knew how to go at it. Didn't want to do it in the object code because that would make a permanent change to the code and might leave a trail. Well, there was a consulting company working on this system, and they undertook to assist the investigator with the investigation, and a young lady who was the site manager for the consulting company came into a meeting with a big pile of logs, and she said, "We know what's happened." And she gets out her logs, and she walks through the logs, and she finds where this individual has come in, finds what they did. And I think you'll have to agree, those of you who have some mainframe experience, this is not a trivial attack. And she concludes that it's a particular individual, and of course they know that it's this individual because this individual is a disgruntled employee, been passed over. It's a system programmer, has the skills, was on site that day, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the investigator concluded that there wasn't enough information to draw a final conclusion, went away. 3 months later, the same attack. In comes our consultant, head of the site manager for the consulting company. She's got the logs again, points to the same guy, but wait. Here come the system programmers that work for the company, and they have logs too, and their logs are sort of different. And it turns out that, and you all knew this was coming, didn't you, the punchline? It was the consultant manager. She did it. Motive means an opportunity. What's the motive? Well, the motive for the other guy doing it was he was disgruntled. He's not disgruntled. He's just a quiet system programmer. He likes being a system programmer. He didn't care that he was passed over. He just wants to be a system programmer and get a raise. He got his raise. He's still a system programmer. He's happy. He had no motivation. He had means. He had the skill level. He had the skill level. But so did she. He had the opportunity. He was on site. But so was she. We're missing a motive here for her. Well, it turns out that the contract's almost up. And if she had lost the renewal of the contract, she'd have lost her job. Nobody thought about this. She misdirected them. Profiling can be misused. Be careful. It's very useful, but it can also send you off in some strange directions. Don't depend upon it to solve your crime. It's just one of your tools. Now, we got to have some goals in an investigation. And from this point on, when I discuss methods of investigation and goals and things of that nature, I'm sure there are those of you in here who have participated in investigations. You have your own style. You have things that work for you, and that's good. If I can perhaps add a little something here and there, I'll be glad. For those of you who have never done an investigation but consider that one day you might have to, then I hope that this gives you a starting point. But my point is that there are many ways to skin a cat. This is my way. And if it works for you, I'm very pleased. If it doesn't, modify it so that it does. First of all, our number one objective is to ensure that all applicable logs and evidence are preserved. And let me begin by saying something that I'm going to repeat several times before we're done. Never, never, never work on the evidence, ever, because you will contribute to it. Always work on a copy of the evidence. So when we say that we want to preserve applicable logs and evidence, that doesn't mean run to the computer that's just been attacked and start typing. Because when you do, you will add to the evidence. Don't touch that computer yet. Yes, sir.
Are there methods of preserving the original considered appropriate?
Are there methods of preserving the original that are considered appropriate? The answer is yes. We take a bitstream image, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. We take a bitstream image. Now, there is a problem, and before 50 hands go up out there, the problem is that we're going to sacrifice something that's in memory that may be useful to us. Unfortunately, we have to make a value judgment. Is what's likely to be in memory so valuable? And this would only happen if we happen to be at the machine at the moment the attack was in process. Is there anything there that's so valuable that we will risk contributing to the evidence in order to capture it? The answer usually is no. Next thing we want to do is understand how the intruder's entering the system. We need then to obtain whatever information we need to justify a trap and trace of the phone line if there is a call coming in, if it is a phone line-based attack instead of an internet-based attack or a LAN-based attack. We also want to be able to get a subpoena if we need to obtain information from an ISP. And in the preceding session, there was some conversation about cooperation with ISPs. There are ways to get ISPs to cooperate. And frankly, I've only had one experience where I couldn't get an ISP to cooperate with me. That experience, eventually, we prevailed. And I'll discuss that in a minute. Next thing we want to know is why the intruder chose the computer, because that can tell us a lot about what the nature of the attack may be. Attacks are like icebergs. By the time we see one, most of it's already over. The damage is mostly already done. What's been stolen has already been stolen. So anything we can do to learn why the intruder chose our computer will help us to do something we're going to do a little bit later, which is reproduce the incident. We want to gather as much evidence of the intrusion as possible, obtain information that can narrow our list of suspects, document the damage caused by the intruder, and then we have to decide if we want to involve law enforcement. So these are our objectives. This is what we're going to try to do when we investigate this incident. Our number one objective, beyond everything else, is to preserve the evidence. And believe me, evidence on the internet, if your attack came in over the internet, is extremely fragile. Extremely fragile. If you're talking about cyber stalking, harassing email, that type of thing, the information that you may need to trace that message may be gone in hours if it passed through a large email system where the logs roll rapidly. You need to act as rapidly as you can. You want to begin your trace back as soon as you can to identify possible log locations. No intruder worth anything from the outside is going to come right into your system, unless you happen to be lucky enough to be the first one that he's compromising on his way to some other one. Contact system administrators on intermediate sites and get log preservation. Now, depending upon the kind of site, you may or may not get access to the logs. They may or may not exist to begin with, but you may or may not get access to them. If it's an ISP, they will not give you access to those logs without a subpoena. Now, subpoenas are easy to get, and I'll tell you in a minute how to get them. But they will not give you access to those logs because that violates their customers' privacy. And they'll get sued. And the only people who will make money is the lawyers. But you can ask them to preserve the logs. And most will, if they have them to preserve. Then we want to contain the damage, collect any local logs we can, image the disks on victim computers. Now, one of the things that we need to do is build an incident hypothesis. We want to try to figure out how this attack occurred. And when I do an investigation, the first thing I do is I begin with witness accounts, and I try to get to actual witnesses as close to the incident as I can, as close to the time of the incident as I can. I want to know what they observed. I want to know what time things happened. I want to know how they knew they were under attack. And these could be people who are users, could be system administrators, anybody who might be able to help me build a picture of what happened at the time that the attack occurred. Then I want to consider how the intruder gained access, and I eliminate the obvious. Things that obviously he could not have done. If there's no way to dial into the computer, for example, we can pretty well eliminate modems. We want to then use logs and other physical evidence and consider the skill level or inside knowledge required to do this. Again, of course, this varies from incident to incident, doesn't it? If it's a completely inside incident, then the evidence that you're looking for may be somewhat different. We want to create mirrors or bitstream images of the affected computers. And the way we do that is we create a bitstream image and then we restore it. That's a physical backup, not a logical backup. A physical backup, and then we restore it to a machine that we can play with. Now, as cyber investigators, cyber cops, we have an advantage over real cops. If we were investigating a homicide, we couldn't go around killing people to test our theory of how it happened. That's frowned upon. It's considered to be in very bad form. But we can kill all the computers we want. Computers love to be killed. I have a computer that his screensaver says, "Kill me." I think one of my kids put that on there. So we need to have mirrors of the affected computers because we want to try the attack on these computers. Because see, there's something we haven't talked about yet, and that is that our explanation may not be the only one. And it's really embarrassing, really, really embarrassing when you go to your boss and you say, "Boss, I know that Philip did it. I can prove it. I know how he did it." And the boss says, "Wait a minute. Philip was vacationing in the Rocky Mountains when that occurred. He didn't even have a computer. He was rafting down some river." Well, I know how it could have happened. So we really need a way to test our incident hypothesis. Okay? How do we build it? Well, we develop a profile of the intruder. What does the intruder know? How would he do this? What did it look like at the machine? What do we have in our logs that help us to trace? What was the path into the computer? Let's see if we can recreate the incident and consider alternative explanations and test them the same way. Now, we have three ways that we can reconstruct that incident. If we get really lucky and we can actually identify the involved computers, especially the victims and intermediate computers, then we can use a physical reconstruction based on actual mirrors of the involved computers. If we're on a big network, we may have access to the network, but we can't go around killing computers because people really frown upon it when their SAP R3 system comes down, just so that you could see if a denial of service attack would work on that HP 9000. So we try similar systems. And if we can't get at the things, hey, we got to do it theoretically, and that's weak. That's weak. So, time to look at a backtrace. We're going to try to trace back from our victim. We've got our victim, we've looked at our victim, we've taken mirrors of our victim, we've figured out how the victim was attacked. We got a pretty rough idea of what happened. Where'd it come from? So the elements of the backtrace are the endpoints, intermediate systems. If we're tracing email, harassing email or something of that nature, we're interested in email and packet headers and logs. And our objective when we're backtracing is to either get to a dial-in point of presence or the corporate network where this came from. Now, you talk to ISPs and you start talking about email headers, and they'll trace back to the account of the email header, and they'll say, oh, we can do that, or oh, we can't do that. The account on the email header is probably worthless. Because if somebody's going to send out harassing email, they really going to put their name on there and their real email address? Are they really going to be like this one guy that was trying to convince a company that he was one of their salesmen so that he could social engineer a phone book out of them, and he sent them email through Hotmail and then signed it with the company's IP address or their domain name rather? And at the bottom it says, get your free email at Hotmail. Oh yeah, he was a tough one. Another one of them leets. So we want to get to that dial-in point of presence. And the reason we want to get to the dial-in point of presence is because there's logs in them thar hills. If we don't have logs, we got a problem. How many times I've gone into a company and I've said, okay, you've been broken into, let's have a look at the logs. Logs? We don't got no stinking logs. I said, well, we're okay, we'll just use the Kenny Kingston psychic log line. That'll do it. If we can get to a place where there are logs that are moderately reliable, and I'm talking about phone companies, ISP dial-in routers like Ascends give you good stuff, Cisco's give you good stuff. Most of the big ISPs keep that information. I was told, and I'm sure that the person who told me was sitting there at the other end of the line with her nose in the air, our logs last forever. Wonderful, it was a phone company, I would expect them to. The only messages that we can't backtrace are those that use a real anonymizer, not pseudo-anonymous stuff, but real anonymizers, and those where there are no logs. Now there are some enabling relationships in our backtrace. Places where we want to look for information. Obviously, we want to look for information at the victim. Want to look for information at any intermediate hosts. Routers may have information for us. They may have information in their cache. And what we really want is to get to the point of the ISP's dial-in, because we have two potential sets of logs here. We have the ISP's dial-in logs, which may, by the way, have caller ID. Many of them do. That's very useful. It's not perfect, but it's useful. It can be defeated, but it's useful. And then, of course, we have the telephone company logs, which we have to subpoena also. And if you happen to ever have to go against Ameritech, bring a battery of lawyers. So these are the places where we're going to look, the points we're going to look for the kind of information that's going to help us conduct this backtrace. Now, I said I'd show you how to obtain subpoenas, and I will. The first thing we need to do is we need to let the involved organization know that we are going to subpoena the evidence. And we need to tell them what we're going to subpoena. I've found that rather than send an email to an ISP, which goes into their automatic mail answering bot, I just call them. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot to find out who the contact point is for a particular ISP. The internet is full of that information, isn't it? We can just go get it and make a phone call. Ask the operator for the security people. She'll know exactly what that means. You'll get the armed guards that stand at the front of the building. Tell them what you want. Be specific. One of the things that came out in the last session was that very often people will contact an ISP and they won't have any specific idea of what they need. You need to know when the event occurred. You need to have IP addresses. You need to know the IP address of the point of presence that you want logs for. You need to know the time and date when it occurred. And what you're after is the account name, account information, anything that they can give you to identify who was connected to that point of presence at that time. Telephone numbers are useful too if they happen to have caller ID. And you tell them what you need and ask them to preserve it. Also ask them what the process for delivering a subpoena to them is. Because most ISPs have a department whose sole responsibility is to manage subpoenas. And they'll tell you how to do this, and they're very cooperative. Well, the problem, of course, is you can't have a subpoena without a lawsuit. You got to sue somebody. Well, you're not going to sue the ISP, you're going to sue the person who broke into your system, but you don't know who that is. This is a problem, but not a big one. We file a John and Jane Doe lawsuit, which basically says, somebody did me, but I don't know who, but I know where the information is, and when I find out, and then you go to the judge and you say, Judge, I need an emergency order because if we don't do this right away, this stuff's going to go away and disappear. And the judge will usually give it to you. So then you go get the logs that you need, everything you need, and get it on the first pass. You can't be like Columbo in this one and be halfway out the door and say, oh, just one more thing. Get what you need, and you may need to depose the system administrator from the ISP. Why? Not because you think they did anything wrong, but because you need to know how the logs were collected and preserved. And you need their testimony, their sworn testimony, in many cases in order to establish that. Now, if you're going to use logs as evidence, because the first thing that the other guys are going to say the minute they get in court is, Mr. Expert Witness, could those logs have been altered? What's the answer? Yes, of course they could be altered. The real question is, how hard is it to alter them? And we need to raise the bar as high as we possibly can. So I like to spool logs off to a protected log host as a normal course of business. If I can put them on optical media, I do that too. This is for critical machines or sensitive machines. I like to use backups, not because they've got the logs in them and they're safe, but because that gives me something that's corroboration. Can't ever have too much evidence. They need to be complete, too, and that means they should cover all super user access, logins and logouts, attempt to use control services or access critical resources, and I like lots of email details. Probably 40% of the backtracing we do is harassing email. Trade secrets, things that go through email systems. Yes?
When you're obtaining these logs, whether it's arising here internally, what's the rule of like number of people as witnesses as you're like setting aside these logs as protection?
Question is, when you're obtaining logs, what is the rule of thumb as to the number of witnesses that participate in you collecting these logs and setting them aside? You know, you can have as many as you want. I think that you need at least one, and you need to be able to swear under oath that the process was a certain process. The other thing we're concerned about is that at the point of collection of those logs, what happens to them from that point forward? We have a chain of custody issue that's very important. We need to be able to account for the custody of those logs from the moment they're collected until the moment they're used as evidence in a court. So I would say that I would never collect logs by myself if I could avoid it. If I call up the ISP and say to the ISP, collect the logs for me, I'm probably going to want to depose the ISP, the guy who actually did it. I'm probably going to want to depose him or her and have that individual tell me under oath what they did, how they did it, and how they've been managing the logs until they came to that deposition.
Should you be using that same ops log from day one?
Should be. The question is, shouldn't we be keeping the same ops log from day one? Yes. And of course, the point is that from the moment we start an investigation, we should be tracking all of our activities. Everything that you do needs to be written down. This stuff never gets to court in under a year. You won't remember. Trust me, you won't remember. Yes? Thank you. Thank you. She is an ISP person. I've been beating on her here now, and I didn't even know it. She's a reformed ISP person. And her comment is, time zone information is critically important. You know, I can't tell you how embarrassing it is to give your lawyer a list of times and have the lawyer forget to translate the time zone, have the lawyer start beating up on the ISP. The ISP delivers the logs just like they said they would, and there isn't a single match. If you've done the tracing right, you'll have several examples, and when you get the logs, they'll all have the same match. But the reason they didn't is because the time zone was wrong, and they were looking at 2 o'clock in the afternoon California time when it was really 2 o'clock in the afternoon East Coast time. Good. All right, a little quickie on email headers, tracing email headers. This is an actual header with a few modifications that we traced, and it went through an organization called iName, which some of you may know of. When you trace one of these things, the header at the bottom is the source, and the header at the top is the destination, and the headers in between are every host it went through to get from source to destination. Now, what's important here, the important thing that I want to show you is that this was a situation where we had a fake user at iname.com. Now, iName is one of these outfits that gives you free email, and you compose your email messages on their website. The website then, the HTML code then takes your message using a simple post, HTML post, and it then turns it into an email message and sends it. So we have here a source of root at localhost by web03 at iname.net. And the reason for that is that that's the process on that server. Now, there is no way on the planet that we can get a person's name out of this. It's not going to happen. The person used a fake name. If you look up the account information, you're going to find that they used fake information there. It's totally ridiculous to think that we could trace this using that kind of information. However, there is some information here that's quite useful. And that information is the time and date. Notice the time zone. The time and date when this occurred, when this message was created. Now that's put there by the computer. So the person who wrote this message wrote it at that time. This is HTML. This is a website. Good Lord willing and the creeks don't rise, we're going to find an access log, an HTTP access log. And we did, or I wouldn't be telling you this story. So we subpoenaed that access log for Web 03. By the way, this message ID is probably worthless. On a big system, in about a nanosecond, that's gone. Won't tell you a thing. So we were able to go to that access log and find out what the source IP address at that time was on Web 03. And guess what? There was only one. That was good luck. So we go to the source address, do a lookup on it, simple old NS lookup stuff, you know, who is, go have a word of prayer with the internet, figure out what's happening, and lo and behold, it's an ISP. We call the ISP and we say, you know, that IP address, what is it? He says that's an Ascend dial-up. So do you keep logs on that Ascend dial-up? Forever. Well, suppose you could preserve the logs for 12 September 1998 at 18:25:13 Eastern Daylight Time, because the ISP was on the West Coast. Yeah, sure, we can do that. And lo and behold, that got us right to the person, right to him. Now, did it take us to the person, the actual person, or to his computer? It took us to his computer, but it took him about a nanosecond to fold. We know it's you. Yes, sir. Sued us for that, too, by golly. So what did we do? We started off by contacting iName's security officer, got the connect account name, time, message ID, and source IP address, of which none of that's worth a doggone bit except for the source IP address. But he gave it to us because we subpoenaed it. Located the ISP, contacted their security officer, got the logs, found out who was connected at the time of the harassing email, and nailed them. The times are your big help there. Evidence collection and preservation. Forensic evidence. Make a backup, a physical backup. There's a product called SafeBack. It's very good for this. For forensic analysis, there's a company up in Gresham, Oregon called NTI, New Technology Incorporated. They've got a great set of tools for DOS. You're going to hear about some NT tools here at the conference. Never work directly on the evidence and always ensure a chain of custody. Always work on the backups or the mirrors. We can use Armon tracing, Armon 2 tracing, to look at cache in Armon 2 devices. A company called ODS Networks has a product called Secure Switch Investigator. Looks for alien conversations. We're looking for those in an external attack. We're looking for those that may have been served from inside the victim's perimeter. It's a dead giveaway if somebody's telnetting into your system and there's a firewall between you and them. They found a way to get in. And then we can sometimes move outwards a step at a time, boundary routers, until we get to the source of the attack. I say sometimes. I'm not going out on a limb for anybody on this stuff. MCI makes a thing called denial of service tracker. It's sort of fallen into limbo lately. I'm trying to find out what's happened to it. It's good. It's a good box, though. Good piece of programming. It will attempt to trace source-forged packets starting at a victim location and go backwards. The problem is, of course, the attack has to be in progress. It starts by logging into the starting edge router, and that's how it works for those of you who are technically inclined. CMDS is the Computer Misuse Detection System. This is really an IDS that sits at a host, and it not only looks for violations of policies, which you program it to do, but it can analyze logs for behavioral changes in accounts. This is great for looking for the employee who went rogue, or for looking to someone who's impersonating a legitimate user and behaves differently than the legitimate user. How do we use it in investigation? Well, under normal use as an intrusion detection system, it needs to sit and learn the logs for about 30 days. But in an investigation, we can go feed it 30, 60, 90 days worth of logs and have it come back with an answer for us. That's available from ODS networks also. So, summary, ensure that you have appropriate policies or you may not be able to investigate and you will have wasted my hour here. Because I assumed you all had appropriate policies. Preserve the crime scene, the victim computer. Act immediately to preserve and identify logs on intermediate systems. Conduct your investigations. Obtain your subpoenas. And some additional info. We have a nice email newsletter. Feel free to ask for it. I say it comes out weekly. That means that it comes out when I get it out. Discusses this kind of thing. New book coming out, CRC Press. Go see our website for additional links. It's www.imfgroup.com. And thank you very much for your attention. I'll hang out here and answer questions. Yes, sir.